everyone. If you'll just be patient with us for just a moment, we're going to get started. It takes about 2 minutes for all the people to load into the Zoom. So if you'll just be patient with us, we'll be getting started in just a minute. Hi, all. If you'll just be patient with us for just another minute or so, we're going to let people load into the Zoom. It takes a couple minutes for 200 or 300 people to load into the session. So if you'll just be patient with us, we'll get started momentarily. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. We hope you are all doing well. This is our 7th webinar discussing COVID-19 and trade. We've been practicing physical distancing here in the Washington area since March and expect this to continue for a few more weeks at least. So we'll continue to try to do these regular webinars. Our next 2 sessions next week on May 14th, we'll be discussing drug development and biopharmaceutical supply chains. And our plan for May 21st is to discuss how ports and logistics have been impacted by the pandemic. Information on both of those events should be coming to you shortly. For today, if you're having any trouble with your Zoom feed, you can log into WITA's YouTube stream, and it will also be streaming there live. If you are watching this on Zoom, you'll have the ability to ask questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. With several hundred people on the webinar, it's hard to get to all the questions, of course, but we hope you'll use that to ask your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. If you did register for the session today on Zoom, you should have received an email about 10:30 this morning Eastern with the panelist biographies and a quick run through of our show. We have a really incredible panel today, starting with our co-host, a returning guest on this webinar series, and a member of WITA's board, Ambassador Darcy Vetter. Darcy, thank you so much for your help on this and so many other WITA initiatives, and more importantly, for your friendship. Today we'll be joined by 3 fantastic guests, all of whom are new to the WITA stage, but well known by many of you in our audience today, and it's a real privilege to have them here today. Each of our guests is front and center right now on critical food security issues around the world. And with this being one of the most important issues facing millions of Americans and maybe billions of people around the world, it's actually humbling to me that they are willing to take the time out of their busy days to join us today. So thank you, and again, welcome to WITA, Beth, Gail, and Caitlin, and thank you again, Darcy, for all your help.
Great, thank you, Ken. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening for those of us who are joining from different time zones. As you know, Ken, these are 3 of my favorite topics, food, agriculture, and trade. So particularly pleased to be able to join this panel on a topic that is so important and so complex. From a US perspective, our food supply has suddenly sort of been thrust into being top of mind for us in a way that it usually isn't. Frankly, we tend to take ample and affordable food for granted in the United States. But we have suddenly been faced with big pictures of empty grocery store shelves with no meat, or stories of people searching for flour and yeast, reports of price spikes of 300% spike in the price of a dozen eggs, for example, temporary price mismatches. We see simultaneous pictures of farmers dumping milk or plowing under entire fields of squash or onions, and at the same time, thousands of cars lined up for the distribution at a food bank as the newly unemployed struggle to feed their families. And frankly, it's really difficult to reconcile simultaneous pictures of surplus and scarcity. But the fact is that the COVID-19 crisis has changed the way we eat almost overnight. Americans used to spend the vast majority of their food dollars in restaurants and eating away from home. And suddenly we are all at home all the time. And the way that we cook at home is very different. We want different products in different packaging, and we shop at different times weekly instead of picking up our breakfast sandwich on the way to work every morning. And frankly, our supply chains have not adjusted to that change. And what this crisis has shown us is that our systems, which were designed for efficiency, to deliver food in a way that was consistent and fast and cheap, was not a way that was very resilient or able to change quickly as people's needs have changed. And frankly, it has laid bare how much we depend on our frontline workers to make our food system operate, whether that are the pickers and the packers in the fields, the meat packing workers in those plants, or the frontline workers at the grocery store checkout counter. And if they are not healthy and well, we are all affected. So the mismatches we are seeing in the US system are ones that are being repeated in similar ways, and similar mismatches in countries around the globe. They may manifest themselves a bit differently, but we are seeing those supply chain incongruities affecting people globally. This crisis, when it comes to COVID and food security, is sometimes being compared to the last time we saw a food price crisis back in 2008. But these crises are fundamentally different in that at that time we were worried about having an ample supply of food to feed people around the globe. Today we seem to have sufficient global stocks, at least for now, but it's our logistics that are challenged. And so we need to keep an eye on how we distribute the food that we have. And so it is all the more important right now that we keep our eye and our attention on our systems of trade, from the tariffs and the customs procedures at our borders, to our transportation networks, to the movement of our farm laborers, and to their health. So today we're going to explore sort of all of those issues with a focus on the global context rather than the US one, and think about what is needed to address and protect food security in the current and in the post-COVID world, and of course with a focus on international trade. And I frankly could not dream of a better panel to help explore those issues. So as a reminder, we're joined this morning by Beth Bechtel, our Deputy Director General of FAO, Gail Smith, the President and CEO of the One Campaign, and Caitlin Welsh, the Director of the Food Security Program at CSIS. We're going to start with some remarks from each of the three panelists, about 7 minutes apiece, to kind of help us set the stage with some of the key things they're seeing on this issue, and then we'll move into a series of questions. Beth, I'm wondering if we could start with you. The FAO, of course, keeps its pulse on the state of the production of food and of hunger in the world at all times, and also really keeps in mind and tracks the welfare and the productivity of the nation's farmers. So with those, or the world's farmers rather, as you look at that, how are you seeing the COVID crisis manifest itself in terms of food and agriculture?
Great, thanks Darcy for the opportunity to be a part of this. And I think it's helpful if maybe I set a little bit of the stage as we think about maybe the global context again and where we sit with food security. And I think it's pretty undeniable that we are really currently facing a crisis within a crisis that is unprecedented in many ways. We tend to talk about the COVID reactions, but I think we need to sort of start with the baseline of where we actually are today in terms of the food and nutrition security situation overall. FAO's own 2019 State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World report, known as the SOFI report, confirms that more than 820 million people continue to suffer from hunger worldwide, and nearly 2 billion are experiencing some form of malnutrition. And just about 2 weeks ago, a consortium of global partners, including FAO, released this very report, the Global Report on Food Crises, which focuses on the more acute and crisis situations around the world. And so I wanted to just spend a minute talking a little bit about what that tells us. In 2019, so last year, not even taking into account COVID, 135 million people in 55 countries are classified as being in crisis condition or worse. And sadly, this marks the highest number in the 4 years since this crisis report was launched. Africa obviously remains the continent most affected. Asia and the Middle East account for a very significant proportion of the crisis as well. Conflict as a driver of the food crisis continues to increase, affecting a very large number of people, but we've also been shocked by weather extremes and other economic impacts and economic policies. And while the slide doesn't show this, this particular report also confirmed that another 183 million people across 47 countries are considered stressed or essentially on the verge of a food crisis. And 71% of that group are also in Africa. Now layer the prevalence of undernourishment with confirmed COVID-19 cases. And again, to confirm, I think the stage setting, the picture becomes even more compelling that we have considerable work ahead of us and that a global response and new ways of acting together will also be needed. And next comes, as we think about the immediate impact, the humanitarian impact, the emergency response impact that we're all thinking about as it relates to COVID, I think it's also incredibly important that we not just focus on the short term, but that we also think about the medium and the longer term. And sadly, as we look at projections for GDP, economic growth across the world, again, think about the layering of these different maps that I've shown you. We're going to see very significant economic downturns in the next 12 months to 18 months in some of these most hard hit areas. I think, Darcy, you talked about at the beginning of your comments whether or not we really are in a place today where we have enough food, or are we going to run out of food? And maybe before I say a few words about this particular slide that we're on related to trade, I'd also like to just say that I think, you were right. In many ways, are we going to run out in the world? The short answer is both yes and no. There is that risk, but we do have plenty of ways to reduce its likelihood. And I think the sooner that we adopt very proactive, science-based, evidence-based types of policies, the more we can avoid exacerbating this global nutrition and health crisis. Right now, in most places, supermarket shelves are fairly well stocked, but already we can see signs that the pressures due especially to the lockdowns in many countries are beginning to impact supply chains. And we are also seeing some slowdowns in the shipping industry. Disruptions, particularly in the area of logistics, certainly could materialize in the coming months. And so right now, I think as a first step, coordinated policy responses are very critical and very important. And I would say, again, before maybe turning here to a few points on trade, it's really important to think about emphasizing the need for enhancing emergency food assistance and bolstering safety nets for some of the most vulnerable populations. Schools are closing around the world, which means that 300 million children will miss out on school meals, which for many of them are already critical sources of nutritious diets. And on top of that, lockdown measures also translate very directly into layoffs and reduced income for people all over the world, making it more of a struggle for families to put food on the table. But if we think about, as you said, and pointed us in this direction, what's the role of global food trade? Well, obviously, global food trade has to be sustained. It has to keep going. 1 of every 5 calories people eat have crossed at least one international border. That's up more than 50% from 40 years ago. Low and middle income countries account for around 1/3 of the world's food trade, which provides very significant contributions both to income and also to welfare. Countries that depend on imported food are especially vulnerable to these slowing trade volumes, especially if, as has been happening, their currencies continue to decline. And while retail food prices are likely to rise everywhere, their impact is more adverse when sudden, extreme, and volatile, and where food costs account for a larger share of household budgets, and where spikes can have longer-term effects on human development and economic productivity. I think it's imperative that we continue to assert that countries should immediately review their trade and their taxation policy options and their likely impacts, and work in concert with one another to create a favorable environment for food trade. The policies which popped up in the form of higher export taxes or outright export bans by some countries during the global food price crisis that you mentioned of 2008 have to be prevented. They tend to produce copycat reactions, and they do make things worse for everyone, not just for smaller trading partners. And so I'll just close by saying that I think it's undoubtedly clear to many of us that open global food trade helps keep these downstream food markets functioning. And so the importance of thinking about these types of very, again, fact-based, evidence-based, very rational and very practical national policies and trade actions be taken very seriously by all of us who are affected by the food and agricultural challenges in today's supply chain. I'll turn it back over to you, Darcy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beth. That was an excellent summary, both of the gravity and the global nature of the situation, but also thinking about what the level of policy response could and should be, what we see there. Gail, I'd like to turn to you next. And perhaps you could give us a snippet about the One campaign, so people are familiar with the organization that you run. And then zero in a little bit more on Africa. Beth mentioned twice the severity of food insecurity on the continent. What are you seeing now in terms of access to food and movement of food in Africa in the wake of COVID? And what are you watching? What's the thing you have your eye on in the coming months that has you particularly concerned? Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Now, hi, I'm the technical genius on the panel. Anyway, thank you, Darcy. The One campaign is an advocacy organization. It's one that I served in government twice and was the recipient of its advocacy for many years. And it's an organization that mobilizes people around the world behind what we think are good policies, and then works a sort of external game, but also a lot of discourse internally with decision makers to try to get the policies that we think could make a big difference in ending extreme hunger and preventable diseases. So we are obviously quite busy right now with a dedicated campaign on all of this. And like your other guests, I think what we're seeing is that while the pandemic may be a health crisis of the first order, it is also a global economic crisis and now an acute food security crisis. It's likely that we will see other layers of this crisis unfold as it cascades. When we look at Africa, just a few things to set the table in addition to the great comments from Beth. The assumptions are that this will likely double levels of hunger on the continent. That will be felt more acutely, as we're seeing around the world, in places where people are least able to deal with the impact of food shortages and disruptions. So in conflict zones, among the extreme poor, in countries where governance is the worst. But if you consider even a country like Senegal, which is a very well-run country doing well economically, 1/3 of the population reports that they are eating less now than they were 2 months ago. So we're seeing this even across countries that don't suffer some of the acute underlying conditions that were pointed out by Beth. But there are a number of other things that are playing into this. And I think it's important for all of us to understand that what we're seeing is a series of sort of systemic failures rather than an isolated crisis or an emergency. Now, those things exist. There is a locust plague going on in the continent right now. There was just in the last couple of days, very acute flooding in East Africa. But what we're seeing is that systems are breaking down. So if you think of remittances upon which millions of people depend, and in fact, in the aggregate globally amount to far more than any of our aid budgets, those are way, way down, estimated to be down by as much as 20%. It's assumed that production could shrink and is on track to shrink by as much as 7%. And prices are increasing. If we go back to 2007, 2008, and the food crisis, then we saw a 45% increase in the price of rice and a 30% increase in the price of wheat. All of these things are playing out in Africa, where again, like the rest of the world, as countries have gone on lockdown and as global supply chains have been disrupted, millions of people have been thrown out of work, particularly in the informal sector, where people, for example, may be reliant on things like tourism, which has stopped entirely. That coupled with lockdown means that many people are pointing to the fact that it may not be the virus that kills them, it could be hunger that kills them. The World Food Program has rightly put out, I think, some very alarming, but appropriately alarming projections on what we could see in some of the poorest parts of the world. So it's bad, but again, I think the solutions rest in things other than those to which we would normally look. In a lot of food emergencies, we look very quickly to, are there small scale things you can do in terms of market stimulation? Can you do local purchases? Can you manage, Darcy, the surplus and deficit that you described at the beginning? You look at relying on foreign assistance, which will be important here, as will some kinds of food aid, particularly those that can be the most flexible or monetized. But that's not enough, because what we're seeing as causal to this, incomes are way down. Protectionist measures are up and are increasing prices. We've got exchange rate volatility. We've got disruption to production and supply chains. And perhaps the biggest thing, and what keeps me up at night, quite frankly, is we've got a very limited and uneven capacity to respond for a number of reasons. The first is that every country in the world is dealing with this crisis within its own borders. And so there are constraints that come from a priority setting, which is understandable on the one hand, but is so domestically focused. And again, I understand this, that we are at some risk of the world's leaders and international institutions not placing a sufficient focus on the global dimensions of this, both in the true spirit of globalism, but also with respect to the world's poorest countries. The second is that we have not seen the kind of symmetry and coming together that, again, we would normally see. I was in the White House working every day on the Ebola epidemic in 2014, for example. That yielded summits, emergency sessions of the Security Council, the kind of coming together of leaders, as did the 2000-2008 food crisis, where leaders came together in sufficient numbers to start to exert some kind of systemic influence on the challenges we're seeing right now. And I'm afraid that even though we have a global pandemic, we are not yet seeing a global response. I do think, if I may, I would just point to a few things that I think could be done and need to be done. One is obviously there are elements of a global humanitarian response being mounted. I say elements because, again, this response is far more fragmented than what would make the most sense and be the most efficient in terms of outcomes, but also the resources going in. But we've got to increase social safety net programs. Some countries have effective safety net programs, some don't. Those can actually be fast-tracked. It's been done before. Again, on remittances, anything that can be done to stem the steady decline of remittance flows, the cost of transactions, the time it takes would make a difference. The United Nations has an appeal out for a response plan, but there's also important funding on food security and agriculture that existed well before this that needs to be maintained. So whether it's support for the UN agencies and their programs, something called the Global Agricultural and Food Security Program that was started several years ago, worst acronym in history, it's called GAPSP, but the refinancing for that is up. It makes a difference. We've got programs in the United States, Feed the Future, that have proven results and outcomes. We need to maintain the funding there. Anything that can be done to stabilize prices and counter the kinds of export restrictions we're seeing would make a huge difference. And the last thing I will mention, which is actually not as costly as some of these other things and can be done and could be scaled, is the work that's been done on resilience, which is reducing the vulnerability of the extreme poor to these kinds of external shocks. There are things that can be done, whether it's on the nutritional level with micronutrients, water harvesting, a host of things where we've got a proven track record of doing those things very quickly. So I think our challenge is not that we don't know what the solutions are. Our challenge is that we have not yet knitted together those solutions and formed or forged a kind of global plan and global response that could get to the systemic causes of this. And the longer that waits, the greater the likelihood that we could see even the most extreme manifestations of extreme hunger. And WFP's just recently pointed to this and used the word famine, which I wish was an inappropriate word to use, but I'm afraid it's not.
Thank you. Sorry, I think that's sobering, but is both a good sense of how the systems interact. I think that's something to keep in mind. I want to come back to some of these solutions that are practical, but again, focus on institutional response and return to that theme a little bit later as well. Caitlin, I'd like to turn to you now. Perhaps you can help us focus on some of those underlying conditions for this crisis, where it's been compared and contrasted a bit with what we saw in the food price crisis of 2008. But perhaps you could talk about the risks that we see on things like global price spikes that we saw then, the tools that we developed and used to address what we saw in 2008, and whether you think those are the right tools to help us in this instance, or if we need some different ones.
Great. Thanks, Darcy. Happy to address those issues. And I want to say thanks for moderating our event, and thanks to WITA for hosting this event today. It's perfect timing for an event like this. Today, I'm seeing new challenges to food security in the US and around the world. And since I started working on global food security policy about 10 years ago, this is the most media attention I've ever seen to this issue. So thank you again for hosting today's event. So yeah, Darcy, I'm happy to lend some historical perspective. And I'll start by comparing today's crisis to the last major global food crisis, which was 2007-08. The nature of that crisis was an actual food shortage caused by multiple reasons. First of all, there were multiple adverse weather events that reduced global stocks of major staples like rice and wheat. And then other factors too, like export bans by major exporters that decreased the amount of food on global markets and put upward pressure on global prices. At that time, energy prices were high, and food and energy prices are strongly correlated. And then there were other things at play at the time, which I'll come to at the end of my remarks. But in 2007 and 2008, about 850 million people were already chronically undernourished when that crisis hit. And because of the factors that I just mentioned, prices of food commodities doubled or even tripled in a short time, and 40 million more people were thrown into acute food insecurity. Today, as we've heard mentioned, it's not supply shortages that are the problem, and news coverage of this issue regularly makes this point, whether it's about empty shelves that we're seeing at grocery stores, where CEOs will say, calm down, there's enough food in the food system, or it's the tragedy we're seeing in today's meat industry in the United States, where analysts are telling us that it's not a problem of supply. So today, generally speaking, it's not a problem with supply, but with a multitude of problems across supply chains and food systems writ large. As Darcy mentioned, as Beth mentioned, today about 820 million people worldwide are chronically undernourished. And the World Food Program is warning that an additional 135 million people are susceptible to food security shocks because of COVID-19. So in the case of 2007, 2008, and in today, it's worth noting that COVID-19 may push about 3 times as many people into acute food insecurity as we saw in 07, 08. Staggering numbers in both cases, but it's worth considering the risk that COVID-19 is putting on global food security worldwide. Today we're seeing disruptions in the entire food system because of COVID-19, and I'll give just a few examples of this. In some countries, we're seeing lockdowns that are threatening the transport of ag inputs, like seeds, fertilizer, and sometimes labor onto farms. And the World Food Program has said that movement restrictions necessary to contain the spread of the virus will disrupt the transport and processing of food, increasing delivery times and reducing availability of even the most basic food items. We're seeing that lockdowns may threaten the transport of food from farms to markets. There's ample stories from around the world, but just as one example, in Brazil, which is a major supplier of soybeans, sugar, maize, and coffee. In mid-March, Brazil's government restricted domestic transportation to reduce the spread of coronavirus. And the measures that they took threatened to disrupt the movement of products from farms to markets and ports, which is problematic because Brazil relies mainly on roads to move their ag products. As a third example, we're seeing social distancing measures resulting in reduced access to urban markets on which many consumers rely to meet their needs. An analysis that was done by some of CSIS's own affiliates found that in Africa, lockdowns are hitting urban and peri-urban residents hardest. And our analysts found that the inability of markets and food-related businesses to operate will affect food access throughout major population centers. And then, of course, trade disruptions. Back to Brazil as an example. Brazil is a top exporter of beef, and China is a top export destination for Brazilian beef. In February and March, what we saw was that thousands of containers of frozen pork, chicken, and beef piled up at some Chinese ports because of transport disruptions, labor shortages, and generally slowed operations. And then, as we've heard already in this event, across the board, we're seeing wage decreases, which negatively affect food security. Again, back to the World Food Program, who says that rising unemployment and underemployment is likely to severely reduce people's purchasing power. Urban populations, particularly daily wage earners in the informal economies and service sector employees, are particularly at risk of losing their income sources as a result of government restrictions to minimize transmission. And we're seeing that many of these things are true, whether you're talking about developing or developed countries. So turning back to the 2007-2008 food price crisis, I'd like to talk about the nature of solutions. I think we're still in the midst of today's crisis, but what we've learned so far is that the solutions we devised to the last crisis don't necessarily match the nature of today's crisis. The immediate cause of the 07-08 crisis was, as I mentioned, a global supply shortage and global price spike. And as a result, the global community coalesced around responses that focused on increasing ag productivity in developing countries hit hardest by price increases. And this made excellent sense for a variety of reasons, which I can get into later. But I think that as a result of that crisis, the global food security community may have come to see that increasing ag productivity was a panacea for global food insecurity. And again, as we've heard other panelists say, the problems that we're seeing today are system-wide. And as I conclude, I want to turn to a report that was put out by the intelligence community in 2015. It was an intelligence community analysis on global food security. This was done by all elements of the intelligence community, predicting that, and this is the bottom line of their analysis, was that we judged that the overall risk of food insecurity in many countries will increase during the next 10 years because of not only production, but transport and market disruptions to local food availability, lowering purchasing power and lower purchasing power and counterproductive government policies. And the intelligence community said that simply growing more food globally will not lead to more food security countries because sustainable access will remain unequal. I think that today's crisis calls for a different response. And as Gail said, it calls for a knitting together of a variety of responses, and maybe the ones that we don't traditionally turn to. So I think that we need to, whatever response we ultimately take, we must acknowledge the variety of factors that are causing people to be food insecure. Trade disruptions, urban market closures, labor movement restrictions, wage losses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's important to note that while this crisis will call for new responses, we cannot divert our attention from the importance of increasing ag productivity. So at the outset, I said that I would return to the causes of the 07-08 food price crisis. And importantly, leading up to that crisis, it's important to note that global food stocks were at their lowest point since the 1970s. And investment in ag had been decreasing since the 1990s. So it's because we lost sight of the importance of ag productivity in the years leading up to that crisis that we experienced the crisis in the first place. So I think that today we need to look at vulnerabilities across the food system without losing our sight on the importance of ag productivity. So I'll end my remarks there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. And I think a good reminder for us of all of the sort of behind the scenes mechanisms that have to be in place to move from one place to the other and truly make it accessible, as you say, access being kind of that weak link at the moment. I wonder if I might stay with you for just a minute to put a finer point on some of that. You know, in the United States, we're seeing farmers are actually euthanizing hogs because they have no place to process them. So again, it's not their productivity, it's the ability to process the, you know, the bounty they have produced through our system. You did mention getting the proper inputs to farmers and how important that is for them to be able to produce, but they have to be able to go to the market. When we were talking about this panel, you had mentioned really how many folks were in that chain, particularly in poorer countries where the number of hands that might touch that food or the local nature of some of those markets really amplifies problems that we may have with productivity or transport. Could you just talk us a little bit through from smallholder farmers to the markets where they take them to consumers, some of what you're seeing and what that means for economies? And then if there are particular things to keep in mind in terms of solutions around that transport or access that you'd want to share.
Sure, absolutely. And Darcy, I think that that's a way to get to the to talk about just the general definition of food security. Food security has to do not only with the availability of food, but also access to the food and the utilization of food for proper nutrition and the stability of those things over time. I think that oftentimes we catch ourselves oversimplifying the idea of food security to mean the availability of food only. So right now, I think that what we're seeing is on a grand scale, a perfect but tragic illustration of the vulnerability of and the complexity of our food systems. So again, it's not about bounty on farms, whether in countries like our own or in developing countries, but food security happens when the system works smoothly, moving agricultural products from farms through all varieties of transport systems within countries and between countries to markets, and then it's including things like storage, processing, preparation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that what we're seeing right now is disruptions across all of those different points. In essence, a lot of different choke points that we're seeing in food systems. And when we look at our solutions, we need to be thinking about all of those points in the process to make sure that those run smoothly, and also that the people who are moving those things along that we're looking out for their own welfare so that they themselves don't become food insecure.
Thank you for that. Beth, you talked a lot about the kinds of policies that are helpful to facilitate the movement of food. We saw a week or so, well, maybe 10 days or so ago now, the WTO report on the number of countries who have imposed export restrictions of some form or another on food, and statements by the G20 and others to try and avoid those. One area of policy response that has always been controversial when it comes to trade have been subsidies to producers. And yet bridging that mismatch in the supply chains and the absolute evaporation of markets that some of those producers are seeing, or frankly, as Caitlin mentioned, just the inability to access the things they need to put a crop in the ground for next year. What kinds of things are you watching when it comes to assistance for agriculture and production of food? And can you talk a little bit about where there might be trade-offs between short-term emergency assistance and long-term sort of getting us back to normal where we want that free flow of goods across?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. And I think it's also maybe an important time for me just to sort of remind the audience, you know, sort of what FAO does and who we are, right? Because I think sometimes our mandate has even appeared a bit murky to ourselves or our partners. But, you know, we're a technical organization. We're a normative body. We're a knowledge center. And so, you know, just as for context, before maybe responding more directly, you know, when you think about and you hear about World Food Program, and then you hear about FAO, we coordinate and we work together, but we do have very different mandates, with WFP being very centered around emergency responses. But I think, as Gail so rightly pointed out, right now, the systemic nature of what's needed helps us, I think, begin to think a little bit more about the nexus between emergency and humanitarian response, now moving into development and resilience response. And that's where sort of the two worlds and the two organizations and other partners that are needing to come together more. So again, just for context, a little bit on mission and the work that we do. You know, we have regional offices, we have country offices all over the world with technical experts in them. And one of the things that has impressed me in my still short 2-month tenure here at FAO is just how much national governments, country governments, ministries of agriculture depend on our own FAO experts and directors for this kind of information. And so when it comes to smart policies, when it comes to being able to provide information about policy, whether it's national policies, trade restrictions, other kinds of tax or export restrictions, we actually do have a pretty incredible direct line of communication into many of those member country representative offices to try to, in some cases, I guess I would just say, talk them off the ledge and really try to inform them about the economic and the real world practical impacts of what they're seeing. But you're right, Darcy, we're seeing a bit of both. We're seeing sort of the knee-jerk reactions to restrictions, but at the same time, some knee-jerk reactions to pump more money, pump more money, pump more money, without maybe necessarily a really balanced view between the trade-offs of both. And so, again, trying to inform that process, trying to have very clear views of what's happening in the marketplace. The last thing that we're doing as it relates to really sort of timely information, and this dialogue is right in the middle of it. We actually are trying to facilitate some virtual roundtables with private sector enterprises to give us real-time sort of marketplace in the know information, so that we can then, again, through that knowledge dissemination, translate some of these real supply chain challenges and operational challenges to the country governments to best advise them. But you're right, it's a bit of the squeeze the balloon in terms of how I think different countries are reacting, and we just have to do our best to keep real-time information in front of them.
I think that's a really good way to put it. And in our conversation a few weeks ago, looking at some of the export restrictions on medical supplies and equipment, I think there's FAO and other institutions can help remind folks that some of those measures may be necessary to get a handle on a public health situation, to understand how to deploy resources that you need, but at some point, figuring out how to transition back to more open trade is important, and the WTO and FAO can help with that. Gail, I thought you did a fantastic job of talking about the fact that these are really complex and systemic issues. But I am going to put you on the hook a little bit when it comes to direct food assistance and understanding that that is not the long-term solution. The sheer fact of millions and millions of people with loss of income means that direct distribution of food is going to have to be part of the response in almost every country. And so as you think about the best way to do that, what are kind of the principles that you would say for folks to keep in mind, both to get food in people's hands, but try to do what you can to protect the livelihoods of those who may be disrupted? And then are you concerned at all about pre-positioning and movement and positioning of that food to be available to distribute, given some of that stickiness and issues with ports, et cetera, that Caitlin mentioned?
Yeah, well, I think that the transportation constraint is a real factor here. And I think that the same kind of principles that I think many of us believe should guide food aid also pertain here. Food aid is going to be necessary, but there are places where there is food available on local markets, and it's a question of transport, logistics, and other disruptions to the system. So where that is available, that should be the first choice, because part of what we need to do is also help stimulate markets, because once those start to collapse, there are all sorts of problems. There are also grain reserves in many countries, and figuring out the systemic management of those reserves. Part of the reasons those reserves are available is for emergencies, and I think releasing some of that stuff. I think matching food aid, when it is external food aid, matching it to markets is important, because we've seen that you can have a short-term immediate impact, but you can have a medium to long-term negative impact if there is a huge influx of one type of commodity into a market that's already under some duress. But I think there are a couple of other things that are newer and quite exciting. You know, as throughout the world, in Africa, we are seeing the opening up and the easing of some of the lockdowns, including because it's proving to be so economically detrimental. And there's really good data on that. And the continent is working as a continent to track all of this and disseminate best practices. So in some cases, cash, food that can be monetized or cash, is important. In some cases, the sort of specialized food items are really key. And whether that's the biscuits that give you all of your calories very quickly, or some of the things we've learned and been able to put in play with micronutrients and other things, those are really, really key. They're easier to move. So I think there is a place for food assistance, and there will be a need for food assistance. I think the risk is, and what we want to avoid is assuming, oh my God, there's a looming hunger crisis. We immediately need to deploy as much as bulk food aid as possible. There's got to be a plan for it, and there are a whole set of tools in the broadly defined food assistance basket. I think using those in combination and with an eye to the immediate need, but also the medium-term impacts, is entirely doable.
Thank you for that. I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. Similar to what Beth was saying, is short-term response, long-term plan to get systems back in working order. I appreciate that. I'm going to ask for your indulgence just a bit here, and then I want to go back to the conversation about institutions and maybe put you on the spot a little bit. But I had the chance to talk with each of you when we were preparing for this panel, and the same thing came up with each, and that really is the importance of institutions, whether that's at the international, the national, or even at the local level. And we have different institutions at the table here today. We have our international institutions like the FAO, we have think tank and academic community that can come together and bring sort of best thinking to bear. We have NGO leadership, but unfortunately we are lacking at this table a national government, and governments here are really key. I currently work for Edelman, a global communications firm, and one of the things we've been doing for 20 years is studying trust in institutions. This is the 20th year of our trust barometer, which measures public trust in governments, business, NGOs, and media across 33 different countries. But looking at this year's trust results and then seeing COVID hit just after those results, we went back and did a 10-country survey and said, how has trust changed since then? And frankly, what we've been seeing is a real decline in trust overall, and governments sitting in last place, government and media. We just got the results of this additional survey that came out and said governments have leapt to the front. Not necessarily because people in those countries suddenly love their governments, but because they understand that with a crisis of this magnitude and as complex as Gail has sort of lined up for us, only governments really have the mandate or the reach to address it. Interestingly, though, what we did see was that there was a gap. Overall, a 5-point gap where there was stronger trust in local and regional governments, where people have maybe more direct interaction, and lower nationally. That was exacerbated in the United States, where there was a 20-point gap. The gap was actually the opposite in a country like India, where the trust was slightly higher in a national institution, where maybe they have more capacity than local level. But overall, the message was also clear that while they thought government had the mandate to lead, they were not capable of leading alone. And that it was important that government, that business, that NGOs providing direct assistance were all part of the equation. So where we know that COVID requires all hands on deck, both to deliver, but also to have your citizenry confident in that delivery, again, that they will be taken care of and are ready to participate in the economy. Can each of you talk about, from your vantage point in these different institutions, where you feel you have critical tools to address trade and food security, but also where you would like more partnership with governments, and how specifically do you think some of those partnerships could be working better? Beth, why don't we start with you? Sorry, I realized I didn't choose.
I think you raise a really sort of tipping point type of topic here as we think about the success of this. And again, you got to remember, I came from the private sector into a multilateral global institution that I am really trying to, one, conform with, but also push the boundaries and push the limits of, and think about new ways of operating. So I have to probably walk the line here of my personal views, maybe versus official FAO points of view. But one of the things that I would share is that I maybe will take it up a level in terms of your comments to that global scale. I really worry about actual faith in global institutions. While I think you're describing maybe more confidence in national governments and maybe, again, localized or national governments to either provide security, provide support, provide guidance. Clearly, and now that I'm 2 months living in Rome, watching sort of the news from back home in the States, seeing US government perspectives right now about questioning whether it's World Health. We're thinking about that at FAO. When does that mindset shift from just being about support for the World Health Organization in a time of sort of, crisis to it extending into other aspects of these global institutions and the coordinated work that we do? And so we're seeing, it's really fascinating, Darcy. We're seeing these calls for bring us together, do more, provide comprehensive responses. But the other side to the coin is that the real facts are, we also are quite concerned about our funding levels, the assessed contributions that member countries make to organizations like FAO. When you think about the recession, and then you think about the political environment and questioning of whether there's the value there or the return on the investment, as you might say, for that kind of work. We're in a precarious position. And so from my vantage point, and I think FAO's leadership's points of view, as we work and coordinate with the other UN agencies and our Secretary General, we have to, it's back to Gail's comment about systemic and coordinated. We can't operate as the UN only as WHO worrying about the health crisis or the public health aspects. It's public health with food and nutrition, with financial, with environmental and climate and sustainability, and all those pieces have to come together in some way. And so again, you know, I think we are sort of operating on this this level of trying to think about how all of those global pieces fit together. But the issues of trust are very concerning to us, and could really even just impact operationally the way that an organization like us is able to function, and the way we're able to partner with the other groups that are here, whether they're NGOs, national governments, or other nonprofits. It's a really important topic for us today.
Caitlin, I want to go to you next as you think about that background and the tools we've used to respond. Are there particular countries, institutions that you'd like to see be more active in this response? Are there things that are missing or partnerships that are working you want to call out?
Yeah, Darcy, I can talk about things that I'd like to see more of. And I think that this crisis calls for a greater response on an international scale. We have seen commitments and statements by at the G20 level, for example, by G20 trade ministers, committing not to impede the flow of critical goods right now. To me, I think that that's the bare minimum that we should be seeing at by a body such as the G20. We have an opportunity coming up with the G7. The United States will be hosting the G7 in a virtual summit in June. That's of course a great opportunity, but we're simply not seeing the level of response and coming together of countries that we did in the last during the last crises that we've experienced. And so we could see the G7, G20, and others rising to the occasion. We could see a new configuration of countries and leaders coming together to address this crisis. But that's where I see the main gap.
Excellent. Gail, could you talk from an NGO perspective where there's, you know, a huge mandate and an expectation that that direct assistance will be coming from the NGO community? What do you need to make your job easier or to allow the NGO community to be the most effective when it comes to partnering with governments or other institutions?
Yeah, if I may, this is a lot bigger than NGOs. And I think we've got a really solid NGO community out there that needs to be part of the solution. It needs resources. It needs the flexibility to be as creative as it can be. We've got international partners all over the world that know how to deal with complex crises. They just need to be enabled to do that, I think, by the donors that support them. But I think the bigger challenge, quite frankly, gets to something that Beth said, which is this is a global pandemic, and we have the opportunity, and I would say the obligation, to figure out what a global plan is. And as much as I would feel great if NGOs were doing great things and the odd government did a great thing, we are not going to get out of the health, economic, or food insecurity dimensions of it unless and until we can knit these various pieces together. So I think there are a few things that can be done that would be my inclination to focus on. One is international institutions are absolutely vital here. The world created these organizations so that the world could collaborate and cooperate to seize opportunities and manage challenges. Now, our international institutions are as good as we make them. And one of the things I found as an advocate and as a senior member of government is that when people, whether it's associations, the private sector, NGOs, citizens, make clear to governments that they want strong international institutions, that enables governments to make them stronger. Again, there are weaknesses, but it's our job as members of any of these to improve them. The second is that I think there's a lot of collaboration that can be undertaken that then can spur governments and international institutions when some of the people participating in this meeting organize and speak as one. I've been on the policy-making side of things where when the private sector spoke up, it was a game changer. And we all know that this is the kind of crisis where, you know, my individual needs and desires on health matter not just for me, but it's in my interest that they matter for everybody in my neighborhood, my community. It's the same with what we're seeing on food security. So are there ways that that voice can be heard and can also come together and say, here's some of the things we think that we in fact can do that would be game changers. So I think it's really a question of whether it's citizens across trade associations, businesses, NGOs, different sectors, organizing. Where governments will act, we should actually act with them. We should use every international institution we've got, but we all need to put forward some pretty big, bold ideas for how to move forward on this. Even as we do the things that are important to do in immediate response, this is big and we've got to go big or go home.
I think that's well said. I realize we're coming up on the end of our time, but do we have a minute for an audience question or two, Ken?
Darcy, I think given it's been such a fantastic and fulsome conversation, I am very sorry. I think we're pretty much out of time on this. I think I've asked the panelists, they can see the questions and they've tried to get to a few of them in their recent comments. If we just do a quick round of closing, if there's any final comments, maybe scan the questions themselves. Sorry we didn't get to more of these. This is such an important topic and we were so blessed to have such fantastic speakers. We wanted to give them as much time as we could to get their points across. So thank you all very much, but give you all a chance to make any last comments. Maybe start with Beth, go right in the order we started, Beth, Gail, and Caitlin, and then let Darcy close us out. And I know we're long already, but we'll try to make this quick. Beth?
No, thank you very much. And thanks to the whole group for putting this together. These are exactly the kinds of conversations, I think, that begin to spur the kind of action that Gail, I think, was empowering and maybe encouraging us to all start to try to take. I know there was a question about labor and migrant workers. I wonder, Ken, if it might be appropriate that perhaps we could send you some responses that could be provided to the group rather than responding to it maybe directly here. But I would just validate that concern that as we think about all these disruptions inside a sort of nebulous, what we call the food supply chain, at the very end of the day, all of this is about people, all of it. I mean, it's about, each person and each livelihood that's affected. All of us now on Zoom calls are affected. The people who work in agricultural farms and fields and production facilities are affected. Their families are affected. People in developing countries who are afflicted by hunger are affected. This is a people issue. It's a humanity issue. And so I do think there is much needed recognition of social protections and human life protections that we have to be mindful of, even when we're talking about sort of the, sort of cerebral, intelligentsia, what trade policy and tax policies are needed. At the very core, I think all of this boils down to us taking care of each other. And those types of social protections are the things that we really need to focus on. So thank you for the conversation. Thanks, Darcy, for hosting us.
Gail?
Yeah, I'll just be very, very quick. And I think the questions are good ones. And one of them asked about examples of where things like resilience have worked. We've got evidence in West Africa and in East. But I think another question was just something I want to underscore about international institutions, because whether it's trust and confidence or some of the other things we pointed to, resourcing, we've never needed international institutions the way we do now. They are all imperfect, as each of us are, as governments are, as nonprofit organizations are, but they are as strong as we make them. So I think the more that any of us can do to both do things like Beth has done, to explain to people, what does FAO do? It's important to know why we depend on it and why we need it. Improve them where we can, but we really need to be exercising them really quite assertively right now to get done what we need to get done. And let me just close in saying thank you so much to everybody who's participated, and to the hosts, and Darcy, to you for moderation, and obviously to my colleagues. Thanks.
Thank you. Caitlin, some closing remarks from you?
Yeah, thank you, Darcy, and thanks for that for that question, Ken. I'll just quickly say that that again, the timing of this panel was perfect. And I think that it'd be quite interesting to come together in a few months' time to talk about how our analysis has changed and to talk about the plans that we're promoting. And perhaps the plans that we promote a few months from now might be a little bit different from what we're talking about today. So just want to put that out there that that I think it might be a good idea to come together to revisit this conversation. I'd be happy to do it. And I think I speak for Gail and Beth that I think that we'd be happy to join you again.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you to WITA. Thank you to all of our panelists for your participation today. And in closing, I think to take us back a little bit to those themes of both trade and of food security, I often think about the fact that while some countries are more export or import dependent on food than others, there's almost no country that is both not both an exporter and an importer of food. And I think all of the panelists have reminded us today, again, of those complex systems and how each sort of link in those supply chains affects the other and ultimately comes back, as Beth said, to people, to their employment, to their income, and then their ability to participate in the purchases of food that keep that system going. And so I appreciate the opportunity to think about how those systems operate, how they could be more resilient, how sometimes they have shown to be fragile, but how some of those simple rules like transparency and not restricting exports and keeping those borders open, thinking about our transport corridors, and that trade is a key element in linking together those different pieces in that supply chain. So again, thank you to WITA and to the panelists for exploring this issue. Appreciate your cooperation and hope we can continue this conversation in other ways after this webinar ends. Thanks.
Thank you, Darcy. Thank you, Beth, Caitlin. Beth, special thanks coming to us from Rome. Really appreciate it. The marvels of modern technology. We wouldn't be able to be hosting you in DC very easily or nearly as easily as we are today. So really grateful to you coming from there. Caitlin, thank you so much. It's great to have you. I know you've been to WITA events, but it's great to have you on the screen and on the stage. Darcy as well. I think we'll take you up on this, and hopefully if we can get everyone reconvened in a few weeks or couple of months, we'll have a different view of this crisis than we have today, because it's changing, if not by the day, by the week, by the day even in some cases. So we'll have a very different view. I hope we're not in a much more acute crisis in this area in the weeks to come. And I hope it is not an urgent session that we're having, but one that shows how we came together. But we shall see. To everyone who's watching still, we have your questions in writing. I'm sorry we didn't get to more of them. I will share them with the panelists. Beth said she'd share her slides with us. We'll distribute those to folks, and if we're able to answer any questions or get materials to you, we'll do that through our WITA website or our communications by email. Thank you all. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to hosting you all again very soon. Take care, everybody. Be safe. Thank you.